hiccups. This is I couldn't even get that working like yesterday. I was tearing my hair out, but at least we've got a picture now. So welcome to the CASA seminar. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Francisco Rowe from the University of Liverpool. Francisco is Professor of Population Data Science. Is that your title?
Right. Yeah.
I've known Francisco for quite a few years. We did our PhDs at the same sort of time, and our PhD supervisors were good mates, and so we kind of bumped into each other. I think was it in Hong Kong or something like that?
I think it was in Umeå in Sweden.
Umeå, yes, that was it. Yeah, so but it never got dark at that conference. It was just I offended Clara Mulder. I remember that conference as well. Anyway, so Francisco is currently the leader, the head honcho of the Geographic Data Science Lab up in Liverpool, who are officially, I think, CASA's kind of main rivals these days, right?
I see it most as friends.
Yeah, friends. And there's quite a lot of kind of back and forth between the two. There's various ex-CASA people up in Liverpool, and actually, we haven't got any ex-Liverpool people down in CASA. Need to. We've got a few of our guys up in your hood, but we need to get the other way. So Francisco does loads of amazing stuff, and he sent me a choice of presentations, and they both looked brilliant. And I said, well, this one on Ukraine is particularly interesting. So I was like, I think that'll be, speak to the audience. We've lost the presentation again. Where's it gone? Oh, no, it's back. It's back. So I will stop waffling, and I'll hand over to Francisco, and welcome.
Well, thank you, Alan, for the invite, and thanks everyone for being here. And I guess as Alan announced it already, so the presentation for today, so I'm going to talk to you about a bit on the idea of how to produce population level estimates from GPS data. And this is focused in the case of Ukraine, so particularly around ideas of population displacement. So this is so all of the work that I'm going to present today, or most of the work that I'm going to present today, so it's related to this paper that is in review, hopefully soon out there. So and I'm preprint to come out at some point soon. So I was hoping that the journal, so they promised that we're going to get the preprint, but it's taking a while anyway. So that is the paper, and I also wanted to highlight that this is collaborative work with Rogers, who is a new PhD student that started last year at the Geographic Data Science Lab, and Elisabetta, who I think is coming in a few weeks. So you will hear more.
You ruined their presentation.
Yeah. So a bit of context for the work, because I guess, I'm going to focus on population displacement, but I want you to take a broader view on this and the methodology that I'm going to present and how this is work that we expect to continue over the years. So for context, right? So what we have is that the number of people being displaced so has been increasing over the years. So we know that the number of extreme events is increasing, and the severity of those events are also increasing. So what we see is an increasing number of population being displaced from the places where they live. And you have that, so that is mainly due to natural disaster events, particularly flooding. So it's one of the major ones. But then also what we've seen is that conflict is also playing a more important role over the last 5 years or so. And then I also included here kind of a picture of COVID in the sense that, so the methodologies I'm going to be presenting today, so it's important in the context of having information to develop rapid responses. So whether that is in the context of natural disasters, violence or violent conflict, and health related responses. So I don't know why this got animation. So a few data challenges. So if we look at the data landscape today, so as you may expect, so lots of the information that is used to develop our informed policy, so historically has come from low frequency data, meaning temporally. So there is low frequency. We have, data, survey data every a few years. So they also tend to have lower representation or lower resolution in terms of when we look at the geographical landscape. They tend to be expensive. They tend to also take some time to collect, process, and release. And then also in the case of when we are talking in the context of natural disaster events or conflict, so those are areas where we have restricted access to collect data. So then there is a range of different barriers or constraints in terms of how we can produce timely information to tackle or to produce responses in relation to natural disaster events or conflict, right? So that is the kind of the context within which we are sort of thinking and operating. So, and then at the same time, what we have seen, right, so is there are all of these non-traditional forms of data coming from digital technology. So particularly thinking on GPS data, so what we tend to get is high frequency of data, high spatial resolution. So you got a few examples that show how frequent the data could be. In terms of so coverage, we also get more coverage in terms that we can get data that could cover an entire system or a country or a number of countries. So then all of a sudden we get access to data scarce environments that we can start operating and developing responses for. And then we also have so data that are available in real or near real time. And again, this is exactly the kind of advantage that I think we want to leverage on. Particularly, we are thinking on rapid responses that we may want to develop. So, however, so here is where we start with, so there are all these great opportunities. However, there are also some constraints when we think about using these novel, non-traditional sources of data. And it's the idea that, so you start looking across the literature. So what you start getting is a bit of an idea that most of the applications, so the use cases when these data are used, is to get some rough signal. So we get an idea of, well, there is some special pattern, there is some concentration of people in this area now, or there is some sort of stability, so an idea of trends or increasing or decreasing trend, or there are sudden changes. So we had this stable pattern, and all of a sudden we got increases, decreases in mobility. So, but then it's very limited what we can say in terms of, I don't know why I got this animation, these population estimates. So essentially for policy and planning, so what we need to get is an idea of numbers. So how many people are actually moving? How large is that increase? So we're talking about 50%, but in population numbers, how that is translated to. So that is the kind of information that people want to know. So we've been working with IOM, for example, so looking at the case of Ukraine. So, and this is, 2022, February, so the start of the war in Ukraine. So, and they wanted to know how many people were moving out of the country, but also within the country. So out of the country, they could get some sort of idea by, looking at people crossing the border. So they were counting people, essentially. But then they didn't know where people were going to from there on. So whether they were staying, they were going back, they were moving somewhere else within Poland, for example, or somewhere else to a different country. So they didn't know that information. And that's what they needed to provide humanitarian assistance. Similarly, within Ukraine, so they didn't know how many people were moving from these areas on the front line or close to the front line or to other places. So then how the population distribution was geographically shifting from areas that were under invasion to areas that were considered to be safer. So, and it's where we saw, well, so we got an opportunity here. So we always, talk about this idea of having no traditional data sources. And an advantage being, so it's almost available in real time. So how we can actually do something about this? And it's when they started asking all these questions about people. We want to know number of people, so we don't want to know. I mean, we know that people are moving that way, so we know that people are leaving Kyiv and are moving west, but we want to know numbers, how many people. And it's where we started thinking, okay, so the key challenge, right, so is the bias that we got on this data. And that is expressed in terms of, differences in access and engagement with digital technology, right? So depending on the kind of digital technology you have, so then you may capture a different group of people. So if we look at the population as a whole, so then you get that a proportion of that population are mobile phone users. A proportion of those could be users of smartphones. And only a proportion of those could be users of particular applications. So if we talk about Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on. They may be the same people, or they may be different groups of people, right? So you get people that use different kind of social media platforms, but not everyone engaged at the same level with those. So then it's where we then have this bias that we are capturing only a percentage of that population. So then how, by using information of a number of users, so we can start getting an idea of how many people actually we are capturing. And from there, how many people are moving between places, right? So that's the basic idea that we are sort of trying to get to. And this is what this paper is doing, right? So it's proposing an approach. And bear in mind, this is the start of a project, okay? So there is a lot of work to do. So this is what I would consider a simple approach to tackle this question. And then from here on, the idea is to start building on this in different ways, as I'm going to describe later on. So the key idea is to propose an approach to produce high-frequency population level estimates of internal displacement using GPS location data. And we use about 20 million plus mobile phone devices within Ukraine, only within Ukraine. So here, as you may guess, there is a lot of data science that needs to happen for those of you that are familiar with GPS location data. So what you get is a timestamp, right? And then you got an ID for the device, longitude and latitude. So from there, so from those numbers, you need to do something so then you can capture mobility, right? So then what we want to develop is this magic box in between, right? So it's how from there we capture mobility by in a way that we could say something about population and get an idea of actual numbers, right? So that is intuition. So now I'm going to go into a bit more detail. So kind of a deep dive on how we did this. So then there is some math, so that's warning. So I normally don't like putting a lot of math into presentations, but I think in this case, I think it was kind of needed just to give a sense of what we're trying to do here. So we use data from different sources. So the main data, as I said, is GPS data, which we source from a company called Pitwell. So it used to be called Echo. And as you may know, a lot of these companies, they change name frequently. I don't know why, whether that is related to what they do or not. Anyway, so we use about 20 million devices of records from 20 million devices. So that means, a lot of points in a day at a different rate. So we use world pop data. So we use the GPS location to get an idea of these mobility population estimates. Okay, so that's why the connection here. We use the world pop data to establish a baseline population data set. So what is the population distribution at a given point in time across Ukraine? Then we use refugee data to adjust over time those population numbers. And then we use geographical boundaries to aggregate the data in different ways, because as you know, or as you may know, right, so we got the data at the geo-coordinate level. So, but then normally policymakers want to have the information aggregated to some sort of geography that makes sense to them. So then we run the analysis at Ryan level, which would be the most detailed administrative boundary within Ukraine, and also at the oblast level. So we got data from 3 different sources. So GDAM, you may be familiar with that you can get administrative data for almost every country. Then we also use data from the humanitarian data repository from the UN, HDX, and then we also use boundaries from the global human settlement layer, because we also wanted to get an idea on differences in terms of urban, rural, and kind of the hierarchy in between. And now I guess what was the main job of this? So the idea is pretty simple, I would say. So, and it's thinking on how we think about survey data. Okay. So the way how we think about survey data is we get a census right here in the UK every 10 years. So then based on the census, we usually develop surveys. And then we say how many people we need to survey so that the data are representative of the population. Right? So, and normally we do that. So there is a process of post-stratification, meaning, so we know what the population numbers are, we get a sample, and we know that to make the sample representative of the population, we need to multiply that by a factor, right? So that we call rate in this case. So that is kind of the intuition of this, right? So then the whole idea here is that then we started thinking about this of, okay, so we can get an idea of population numbers by establishing a population baseline, which for us is going to be world pop. So this is population 2021 pre-war. That is our baseline. So we can get a sample using the mobile phone data. So we get the mobile phone data, we consider that and we treat that as a sample. We know that it's not randomly selected, but let's ignore that for a minute. So we take that as a sample, so we can get an idea of numbers in each place within Ukraine. And then we need to get the rate, right? So that's what we don't know. So let's start from 1 to 5, okay? And before I continue with this, so this is because I know that DAC is going to be here next week or online. So we've been working now with DAC because we figured that we're working on related problems. So he's also been looking at producing population nowcasts. And he also looked at Ukraine. So now we're working together on looking at related programs on how we integrate different sources of data, because he used Facebook data for that. So anyway, so credits also to the work that DAC has been doing, because what he's going to present probably next week is going to look quite similar in relation to this. So, okay, now with the approach, right? So then what we do is then we compute what we call this baseline penetration rate, so which is essentially the mobile phone users population divided by the population at the baseline. So we establish that, yeah. So baseline is time 0. So then we establish that penetration rate for each location within Ukraine. So on that location depends whether we are looking at oblast or whether we are looking at rayon, or whether we're, so I think that would be the 2 geographies that we use, because then the urban areas then are aggregations of rayons. So that is the first step. So, and then we sort of reuse that penetration rate to start looking at other periods in time, right? So every single day, then we can start computing. So looking at this relationship, we just move that to the left, divide by R, and then we can start getting population numbers by that correction, right? So, and we do that for every single, again, area within the country. And then we can at least get some basic population estimate. But then we sort of realize, well, so the problem is that we're assuming that that's sort of fixed, the population is fixed. It's actually not fixed because we know that a lot of people are moving outside Ukraine. So we got an issue, right? A lot of refugees. So, and we know that the war has led to probably the biggest refugee crisis globally since World War II. So then we needed to do something for that and correct for the number of refugees. So we compute this correction factor to correct for non-stationarity. So the idea that there is fluctuation over time in the population, it's shrinking. So then we get the population number and we subtract the number of refugees, the number of people leaving the country. And we adjust for that also, right? So if people are returning, right? So we get the ins and outs. So and then we multiply the population to get the final estimate that we consider to be the population estimate for a given area at a given point in time. And then we get the idea of population displacement by looking at the difference between the population at baseline and the population at a given point in time. So then we can get an idea of how many people are leaving, or if any region is gaining population, how many people are arriving, moving in at a given place. So, and then we run a validation process, which is always tricky in these cases, because usually you start using this sort of data and these sort of approaches because there isn't any data set that you can use. So then you will develop, new methodologies. So there isn't any particularly good in terms of, that is the gold standard data set that you should compare to. And therefore, if that tells you the same, so then we are good and we can claim that this is all good and fine. So then we went for what we think is the second best. So there were two data sets. So I mentioned DAG data set. So he looked at a similar thing, population displacement, using Facebook data. So he looked at the first 7 months, I think. So we got the data from them, and then we also got data from the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. They were running a telephone survey. So what they do is every month they randomly, so they have the telephone record. So and randomly they dial a number, people, answer, and they ask a number of questions, right? So and they do that. They collect a sample of 2,000 people, and every time that they do that, so it's a different set of people. It's random, so it could be the same, but normally it's different. Right? So from there, somehow they also come up with population numbers, which is so you need to see the magic video. It's a little magic, I think. So yeah, and I guess one important thing here is that we had to. So how we define population from the GPS data, right? So we were looking at resident population, so people sleeping in a place, so we wanted to have their usual residential place. So from as I said earlier, right? So from the GPS data, you only got the X and Y, or longitude, latitude. So then how we define, whole location is quite critical in this case. So we followed so the UN methodological guidance on how to use model phone data to capture migration. And they recommend that, so looking in most cases at the location data, so where people were between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. So it's kind of, it could give you a good sort of definition or a good sense what is the residential location place, if that place is or if people are regularly there, right? So then we segmented the data. So for those, where the devices were at those between those given times. Then we counted the number of days at which people were. And then if people were, between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., more than 50% of the time in that place, and they were for over 2 weeks in that same place. So then we said, okay, that is the whole location for a person. So we tried, changing the times. So changing the times, there is not much variation in what you get as an outcome. You start changing this percentage on the percentage of time that people spend. So there is a bit of a threshold. So I think if you move a bit over to 70, so then you find big changes in terms of numbers. But we felt that 50%. So given what we saw, it makes sort of sense. So having done all of that, then I can get to show you a few of the results of this. So this essentially, so we look at the first few months. So from March, February, we had data from February, first day of the war, to August 31st or 30th. 31st. And we look at, so the number of population being displaced within Ukraine. And we were trying to map those two key events, so which is not particularly straightforward because there are a lot of things happening, and it was really, really difficult to identify, what was more important. But anyway, so you can see, so how there was a big increase at the beginning, and also bear in mind that we're looking at these two different levels. So Ryan is the more granular level of spatial aggregation, and Oblast, which are regions a bit bigger. And as you would guess, so for Ryans, the number of population, the number of displacements that we capture is higher because we're looking at movement between smaller regions, right? So then it makes sense that, so if people move, a few kilometers away, then, there is already a displacement under this definition. But I guess important things to note is, at the beginning, there is a big increase, then that kind of stabilizes. But then after, June, so there is a big spike, particularly when we look at the Ryan displacement metric. And we we don't know the source precisely, but what we think is that is at the time when people started moving back to Kyiv. So people have moved to the west, and then people move back to Kyiv. Because also when we start looking then at the individual regional statistics, we start seeing that oblasts in the west of the country start doing something like this, right? So they are showing higher numbers of people moving from those places. Then we also, something that the IOM wouldn't do is started looking at this spatially, because, with 2,000 people, you don't have enough representation to make that sample representative of, any sort of geographic aggregation. So then what we could do is started looking at disaggregating this spatially. And for example, so here we wanted to look at, the key origins, key destinations, or where people were moving from and to, and how that was changing over the course of the war. And this was, I guess, also a validation check for us, because, so things that we were expecting was the city of Kyiv losing population at the beginning of the conflict. We knew that a lot of people were leaving. We have, Russian forces coming from, from the north, approaching Kyiv, and we know that people were leaving. So we saw that on the news, and, the biggest numbers were coming from Kyiv, and that is what we see here, right? So in blue. Blue is negative, red is positive. So, and then what we also know, and we're also expecting to see, is that after Russian forces withdrew from Kyiv, from the north of Kyiv, and moved to the eastern front, so then we were expecting to see people returning back to Kyiv. and here in red, that is what we tend to see, right? So equally, so there are areas in the Eastern Front, so like Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, we were expecting to see that people also were leaving those places. So those places were losing population. And that is sort of what we tend to see here consistently, right? And another thing that we could see using the GPS data, but IOM couldn't see, for example, was what was happening in Crimea and what was happening in the Russian occupied territories, because they couldn't go there. They are not allowed to, to get access to those people. So we could get an idea of what was going on in there. And equally, so you look at the Western front or Western oblast of Ukraine. So on this side here, what we were expecting is to see population gain. So people moving into those places because they were safer. Also, they were close to the border. So people were transitioning there before moving into Poland and other neighboring countries. And that's what we tend to see. And as I said earlier, also, what we tend to see later, this is not something that we expected, but it's something that we saw through the data, is that people in these areas were moving back to Kyiv. And that's what we tend to see a slightly, so a slight blue here. So people, so these areas were kind of losing population because people were returning to Kyiv and, areas along or close to Kyiv. So then we started also looking at, so we wanted to get an idea of whether there was any sort of, process in terms of the hierarchy of places, whether people were concentrated in urban areas, because what we were seeing as shelters in terms of, it was where most of the help, most of the humanitarian assistance was concentrated. So people were moving there, or whether people were actually going there and moving back to more rural locations, or was more picking up, the assistance and then moving back. But then what we tend to see, so we reclassify the global human settlement layer into 3 areas. So we just wanted to have a much simpler version of that. So into urban, suburban, or peri-urban and rural. So we map them just to give you an idea where they are. So you probably can't really see the suburban bit, but that is what we also look at the evolution of that over time. And I guess, as you can see, so the proportion of people in urban areas has been increasing over the course of the war. And that, again, so tells you a bit of the dynamic of conflict and what people do when there is, conflict of this sort of scale. People tend to converge to these urban spaces, and particularly this being around Kyiv. That is where people are essentially moving to. And the other question that the UN had was this idea about return movements, because they knew, okay, people are leaving. They could know that some people, were either had intentions to return or were returning, but they weren't sure where they were going. Right? So they could see that people in the border were moving back from Poland into Ukraine, but they didn't know whether, humanitarian assistance had to concentrate on the bordering areas of Ukraine, or they had to send, humanitarian assistance in other places across the country. So then we started looking first at numbers of, kind of getting an idea weekly, how many people are returning, to getting a sense of, the scale of that. And as you can see at the beginning, so this is, and I should be honest here. So this is probably the statistic that we're less confident about, because the definition of return mobility, it's pretty loose in the sense of how long you need to stay back in the residential area to be considered, a return move. The UN uses 2 weeks. We think that is way too short. And actually, we look at the distribution of people staying in the same location after they return, and it tends to be about 6 weeks. I think that is kind of, most people tend to stay 6 weeks at the same place. And, so then whether 2 weeks is enough to be considered, a return migrant or, mover. So I don't know. So there are questions there. But anyway, so we look at this. So what made sense for us here, it was that the number of returnee movements, so increase in June or around this time when we know, and we have anecdotal evidence from the UN as well, that people were moving back to Kyiv. So because of remember that Russian forces kind of withdrew around this time here towards late April, early May, but people didn't return immediately. So some people returned to Ukraine, but they stay in the neighboring or the bordering areas, bordering towns. And then once, they allowed some time, once they knew that it was safe to return, so they started moving. And I think that's what we notice here. So there is kind of a peak of return mobility. And then we wanted to see where people were moving to. So looking across oblasts. And again, so you can see here that Kyiv, so it's one of the places where people tended to move. So then there is also Dnipro, which was another place. Lviv, which is one of these areas that is one of the bordering towns that you would expect that people are moving there, but then, it's kind of more a temporary destination, I would say. People may return, but may move quite quickly from there. And less so, other places that were close to the front line. I mean, Crimea, so then we lose signal from Crimea. We don't have anyone, so to get an idea of whether people were returning there. But we could say, that other areas within or close proximity of the front line, so they weren't really drawing a lot of people back. And then we also wanted to know a bit of getting a sense of, so whether these were people that have moved, very far away from their original residential area, or whether people were moving, to the next town and then moving back. And kind of when we look at across the country, that's what we seem to see. So is that most people kind of move very close to where they are from and then move back. So people that tend to leave the country, very few of those kind of tend to come back, at least, in more long-term basis. Except for Kyiv, where we see that there is a bit of a spike here towards the end, so where people are willing to travel very, very long distances to go back to Kyiv. We assume that those are movements from, people coming back from outside Ukraine, staying a few nights or a few months in these bordering towns and then moving back to Kyiv. And so I guess to conclude, so this, I guess, gives us an idea that, these non-traditional forms of data from digital technology have a lot of opportunities to enhance our understanding of human migration and mobility, and give us a way, an instrument, a resource, a tool to kind of improve policy making, humanitarian assistance planning. But also we have, a big challenge, which is these biases that are sort of embedded in this data that we really want to leverage on the opportunities. So we need to address the biases. And I guess here, this gives me the opportunity to promote this project, which we're working with Carmen. So we got a bit of funding through one of the accelerator accounts funded by the ESRC. So we're working and focusing on the UK in particular. So we're looking at different mobility data, well, I should say location data, to extract mobility patterns. And the idea is that we want to develop a general methodology to produce population level estimates. Right? So the idea is that you can plug any sort of data and then you can get population estimates at the other side or the other end of the output. So and the key here is so we want to produce a piece of software. It's going to be available probably in R. And if Carmen wants to write in Python, so then she could do it. And then so training resources will become available along with the package. So that is the idea. So here there is a QR code if you want to have a look at the website, get a bit more details on the project. We are working with the UN Office on Migration and also Meta. So we are hoping that it's going to be a very impactful project. We'll tell you in a year or so. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Right, questions?
Having worked with some GPS data before, I'd be interested to one if you got the data raw, so like the pings, multiple pings off a single device, for example, or if you got the data as a count, how you manage the rebalancing of those counts or the scaling from the data provider side.
We got the raw data.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. In terms of the bias and a little bit on your project and based on what you've just presented, to what extent do you think like cultural aspects or geographical aspects would impact on that, and how transferable these de-bias techniques would be?
And I think that is an excellent question. The quick answer is I don't know. So that is, I guess, why we have this project to try. One of the key ideas of the project is divided in 3 parts. So the first part is developing all these tools so we can assess the level of bias. And I guess that goes with the idea of, we may have the extent of bias may be different across different areas, different countries, different populations. So yes, and different data sources. So we are kind of developing that. So at the minute, I don't know. I would suspect there are differences, and the approach will be general in the sense that can be applied. So to what extent that will mitigate the biases, I think that is a different question. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. So I wonder if there's any social economic or like demographic data associated with the GPS, because when we talk about displacement of people, it's interesting to distinguish soldiers and non-soldiers, like how they move between different areas of Europe.
Yeah, so you mean attributes of the population?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, normally with this data, you don't get access to any population attributes. So you get the timestamp, the location data. And so normally what you would do though is look at the profile of the area. So then it's population level data. So you look at this proportion of people, from affluent backgrounds, or this proportion, from more deprived backgrounds. And then you sort of work out, what is the relationship between the two. So we haven't done that here, but yeah, so that's normally how you would do it, unless, so you are very lucky and a provider gives you access on population attributes, but, normally it's pretty difficult to get.
We hear about your name from multiple sources. We're currently working with us for a while. About this data, Ukraine data, remember back to 2022, 21 and 22, and it said somebody, I think a data provider, and they wanted you given this data for free as kind of supporting the research. It's one wrong, can I say? And they did mention the data may include some soldiers in this area. I think that's also one first question. So when you estimate the population, did you exclude this parcel?
No, we didn't. It may well be that, we are capturing also troops moving, and yeah, that may well be the case. Yeah.
And also when you work on this topic, did they raise any ethical issues, or because the happy soldiers moving around these areas is kind of a sensitive topic, right?
Yeah.
So did you map those kind of
We have those conversations, so that's why we didn't present any data at the kind of geographical analysis at the riot level. because that's considered to be way too little for what is required. And we just kept that at the population level trends. But yeah, so we had a lot of those discussions, and that is one of the things also the IOM is very careful about, because they don't. So they are producing at the minute a new data product, which is trying to get estimate at the right level, but they don't share the data with academics or any other organization, unless it's a humanitarian assistance organization. But yeah, so yeah, there was a
Yeah. It's we in my group we use this data to do more looking at application about mobility, but not really on population modeling. So I was wondering, what are the main approaches to validate the population estimation? I mean, like estimate population from those kind of data, or small areas estimation, synthetic population generation. What is the main approach to validate your information?
Yeah, well, I guess so we've been going by application, depending on the application, depending on the country, we use different data sources. So for example, for this one, we just use what was available from IOM and from DAC that produced other set of estimates. But so I also been involved in work for the government of Chile, and they produce a new data set, which is a population register, integrating different sources. So then they wanted to validate their own data. So then we pulled data from other sources. And the key idea was there not to find one-to-one correspondence, but to find trends that were aligned to each other. So then we did a lot of analysis. We compute and look at a lot of different metrics. So looking for correspondence. So we weren't looking for, let's say a correlation coefficient of 1, but so some deviation from that, but to show the same sort of trajectory in terms of spatial patterns and stuff like that.
So
But it would be good to talk
it's a
about.
challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge. Yeah, I think it's a challenge.
Great.
Sophie, I think this first.
Yeah, just following up on the soldiers question, I suppose that actually, though, if that was having an impact on the analysis, then you would probably see the opposite migration patterns, right? Because you would see all of the soldiers moving to the conflict zones rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
So I would imagine that maybe it's quite a small fraction, but if you did want to control for it, then I think when doing something like similar, very different, maybe what you were saying about the proportion of the population per admin unit level that is classified in the census as a soldier, then you could maybe include that in some way as a control factor to just remove them from the flows. I don't know how it would work with the granular data, but I don't know if there's some ways that consider both at the same time.
Yeah, I think that could work. I guess the only thing I'm thinking now is because so they've been trying to recruit people, they have been recruiting people over the course of the war. So then how the proportion of people they have managed to pull locally from other places. I think that will make things very complicated. I don't think that information is available. But yeah, I think if that were available, yeah, that's probably the approach that would take.
Maybe your proportion of, I don't know if it'd be young men who are recruits or I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, I guess something to have in mind is that I guess so that the IOM and DAC studies, so they both show that women and children, the majority have left Ukraine, or I guess let me rephrase that, the majority of refugees are women and children. So men have stayed within the country unless they are, age over 65 years old. But that, yeah. So, but I guess that doesn't address particularly, what you're saying. But I just pointed to what sort of mobility patterns we're looking at here. So it's mainly men. So there will be some differentiation again by age. And but the age bracket, I think that they've been trying to recruit So it's 25 above. So younger people, they've been allowed to study, and continue with their normal life. So but that's been changing again. So I think that's why it makes it difficult.
One last question. Because I'm conscious of it. Guys in the masters, you've got a class of 2, right?
Three.
3. Oh, okay, so you got better. That's enough. Yeah, one last question. You can have the last question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Super interesting. I was interested in this aspect of kind of academia and international organizational cooperation in this project, and I was wondering what the modality was of how you work with IOM. Was this a contract to them, or were they giving grants to the lab, or like how did you work with them? What was the arrangement?
Good question. I mean, so for this particular project, there was no contract, nothing really returned other than one done. But I guess if I can take this kind of back time, so we started working with IOM because during the pandemic, so they knew that I was working on a different project that was looking at Twitter data and analyzing sentiment against migrants. And so they knew about, anecdotal evidence that people were, so then incidence against Asian-looking populations was increasing in English-speaking countries in particular. So they wanted to know to what extent this was a thing or not. So then we started working with them. So we had that, and that was a contract, was a consultancy project. It was all very quick. It's always very quick. That's probably one thing, to know. So it's always, we wanted this for yesterday. And then you need to try to catch up with them. So then it requires a lot of your time and effort and, resources that not many people will have, which is an issue. So in that context, that was a bit more organized. So this other project was a bit more kind of, we had the data. We wanted to show people that actually you can use this data. So we have all these claims always that this data are in real time and we can use them and they are very beneficial, or could be. But, we normally don't do that. So then we thought, okay, let's engage with it. Let's put some time, let's work. And we did that. And then we got, something and we said, so we got this, are you interested? And that's how we started conversations. But then, we're working with them and they are very supportive, but also, so one thing is that they sort of, all of the UN institutions, they compete for funding internally and there is a lot of politics. And so they get a very small budget and usually it's through donations. And those donations usually have a purpose. So they are donating funding, but they want to do this, right? So it's not that they got to pull a block of cash that is available that then when this happens, then, I want to hire you. So for example, DAG, that's going to come next week. So it's probably going to give away. Should I give away something? So he will tell you, because they also been working with the UN. And so through the World Health Organization, they got funding, but it wasn't through IOM, which is funny. But they were the ones that have funding, not IOM. And so they saw it as a, health-related problem. So they want to also to get information. Anyway, I guess if I can say something is, it requires a rapid response. Usually you don't get a lot of funding. Usually you don't get a lot of credit for it. But it's, it's, I don't know. So you're motivated by impact, not only by research, kind of seeing that, research is going to lead to something. I think that is rewarding enough. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Right. Well, it's 2:00. So thanks again to Francisco. That was fantastic. So Francisco is going to be here for the rest of today, also tomorrow morning, I think, as well.